Thank you very much, everybody, for joining this webinar today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So today we are launching our new note entitled The Role of Social Dialogue in Promoting Living Wages. And so the discussion today is going to be around this, around how social dialogue can help implement living wages. Let me start immediately by welcoming Romina Boarini, who is the director for the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity, who will tell us about their work, the work of the WISE Center that touches upon the issue of living wages. Romina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenda, and thank you so much, Global Deal, for the kind invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you today in this important conversation. Indeed, living wages is a concept that has attracted a lot of interest, and in our center in WISE, we've been fortunate enough to follow and contribute to this debate. The context for this work has been a collaboration with a coalition of companies called Business for Inclusive Growth, that was actually launched in the wake of the G7 French presidency. And this is a group of companies that took strong commitment to make the business model more inclusive. And one very specific line of action revolved around paying living wages. But it's quite interesting to see that besides this very particular coalition, there are a number of other business coalitions and groups today that are trying to spearhead and push forward an agenda of living wages. And this is, of course, happening in a context of rising inequalities and large in-work poverty in OECD countries, which are trends that have been highlighted, exacerbated by the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So obviously, this is a very, very topical issue. The work we have done in WISE consisted of reviewing existing methodologies to calculate living wages. So it was a very, very technical piece of work, really focusing on measurement aspects. We analyzed the robustness of the data and the approaches, but also the ability of living wages to support a process of dialogue among the living wage stakeholders, which is the focus of today's conversation with you. One of the main results of that work was a call for increased transparency on the data, the methods, and the approaches, and that really on multiple fronts and from multiple actors, the ones that produce the data, the ones that use the data. So we really argued in favor of the idea of developing a common framework for calculating living wages, based on a common set of assumptions that need to be, of course, underpinned by evidence-based analysis, but also large and deep consultation with the stakeholders. And so I really hope that today's discussion is going to help advance this agenda in that very same direction. So the way we've structured the work allows us to essentially identify some key principles for designing this common framework. So this is the type of recommendations we put forward. So what would be the main elements of that common framework. First, we said that it would be important that the common framework strikes the right balance between tailoring the living wages calculation to the specific context and businesses' needs, but at the same time, that framework needs to be supported by global guidelines that allow companies to implement consistent living wages across markets and times, but also support the needs and the costs of workers globally. The second principle was around setting and introducing living wage thresholds in close cooperation and consultation with the stakeholders, the workers, the worker representatives, trade unions and firms. And again, that is really what you're going to discuss today. The third principle was about integrating considerations of social needs, prevailing norms of decency and social inclusion. This is, of course, quite important. The whole traditional measuring living wages, obviously, is based on understanding how we can best appreciate poverty and multidimensional deprivation. So that is quite important, to make sure that the social needs are obviously taken as a core consideration in determining the right living wages. The fourth and final principle was about understanding living wages in the broader context of the existing social protection system, so with a clear articulation of responsibility between the private and the public sector. We think that this common framework would constitute the basic steps of a living wage journey, the one that many companies are interested sort of in embarking on. And this framework and this journey really could again provide a lot of transparency with respect to the many commitments that companies are taking at the moment, and would allow to obviously build on the momentum that companies are trying to sort of foster at the moment. So a lot of interest, a lot of I would say very genuine interest and very innovative initiatives on living wages, but at the same time having more transparency and a clear vision and also clear implementation plan could, in our view, help sustain those commitments and make sure that those commitments obviously do result in an improvement of the well-being conditions of the most marginalized and the lowest paid workers. In closing, I'll just like to refer to another little study that we have done in the OECD, and this is looking at essentially at the expectations of the public, expectations of citizens on what companies should do to reduce inequalities. And first of all, according to this representative survey, the large majority of citizens, 7 people in 10 in OECD countries, support the idea that various actors really take responsibility for reducing inequality. So obviously this is an agenda for governments, but actually it is interesting to see that 7 in 10 people say businesses and investors have a very big role to play. And in addition, 2/3 of the respondents believe actually that one of the major actions that the private sector could take to reduce inequality is paying fair wages to the lowest paid workers. So that actually means that there is a strong social consensus around the need for living wages. With that, well, let me thank you again, and I wish you a great discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Romina. Thank you for these important points, and the work that you've done has been also the basis for the work of the focus group that I'm presenting today, and also very complementary as we focus mostly on the implementation side and on the role of social dialogue. So let me bring up my presentation. So again, I'm going to very briefly go through the note, which focuses, as I just said, on the role of social dialogue in the context of promoting and implementing living wages. So there isn't, and we'll probably hear this again in the panel, there isn't an internationally agreed definition of a living wage, but from what Romina just said, also you get the sense that a living wage needs to be designed to ensure a satisfactory quality of life. And Romina was also mentioning actually the multidimensionality of deprivation. It needs also to provide a safety buffer and to align with the compensation for normal working hours. The Global Deal set up a focus group on social dialogue for the promotion of living wages in 2022, and the group met 5 times. It was chaired by Sofia Valne and Atle Hoy, who are also on the panel today, so they'll tell us more about their experience. And over these 5 sessions, the group investigated how social dialogue can promote living wages within companies and across their supply chains. And the note compiles the outcomes of the group, the successful examples that were presented in the focus groups, and the different approaches and expertise that we shared. So the concept of living wage is regarded by the international community as a human right. It is reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone who works should have the right to a just and favorable remuneration that ensures that him and his family have an existence worthy of human dignity. I'm almost reading here what the definition they include. And achieving living wages is also important to achieving many of the sustainable development goals of the 2030 agenda adopted by the United Nations in 2015. It contributes directly to helping eliminate poverty and hunger, so SDGs 1 and 2. It helps advance decent work and economic growth, SDG 8. It can also help reduce inequality, so SDG 10. 10 and also close the gender gap, SDG 5. It's also an enabling right. So the living wage is seen as an enabling right, as it can have a positive spillover effects on other human rights and sustainable development goals. It's also included somehow in the ILO Constitution, which doesn't refer directly to a living wage, but talks about an adequate wage in its preamble. And then there's several international initiatives that have already developed in the past few years. Romina was referring to Business for Inclusive Growth, so I won't repeat. She's already explained what the initiative was, how it started with the OECD and the number of big companies with the objective of achieving inclusive growth, and a particular objective to urging the global business community to join in to close the living wage gap. Another interesting global initiative is the United Nations Global Compact, which was set up in 2000, which encourages companies to embrace living wages as a fundamental pillar of ethical labor policies. Now, why living wages now? So again, Romina said a few words about this. There are increasing inequalities. The in-work poverty is very high, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused many low-wage workers to lose their jobs and find themselves without much coverage, and the cost of living crisis, which is also increasing costs for households. But it was already an issue prior to the pandemic when global supply chains had started to expand quite significantly. And there was a feeling again that some global companies were not able to verify or to take responsibilities for what was happening along the supply chain. So what are the benefits of a living wage? Clearly, there are benefits for the people receiving the living wage. We've heard, I just mentioned, the just remuneration, having a remuneration that allows you to live a dignified life. These are the kind of wording that's used internationally in the various declarations. But there are benefits for employers as well. So, for example, a living wage can, increases the quality of life, increases self-confidence, can improve satisfaction at work, fosters also a better balance between professional and personal life, and all this can increase productivity. There's also an improved reputation, better reputation for companies who are paying living wages and therefore adhering to legal standards. Paying living wages can also contribute to the long-term sustainability of businesses, because it has a positive impact on the communities where the business is located. And then ultimately there's also a macro benefit in the sense that increased wages mean also increased purchasing power for low-income households, which then stimulates economic growth and can benefit the business community. Now, the social dialogue plays a key role. Romina has reminded us also that it plays a key role. It's one of the key principles of the common framework that WISE is suggesting to develop. Social dialogue, of course, fosters trust and understanding more generally. So it stands to play a very important role in setting wages through collective bargaining, but also in the timely and precise payment of wages. It can ensure that workers have reliable working hours, that they have access to non-wage benefits, and also it establishes a platform to address all aspects of defining and then implementing living wages. Again, Romina was talking about something very important, so finding the right balance between a global commitment, but also contextualizing living wages to the specific local or business situation. So at the webinar last week on human rights due diligence, we discussed precisely that. So the role of social dialogue in helping contextualize any commitment to the specific reality on the ground. So here as well, social dialogue for living wages can play that particular role. In the brief, we discuss in the note, we discuss several case studies. So I'm going to briefly go through some of them. So we looked at Unilever's living wage commitment. So Unilever committed to paying a living wage to its own employees in 2014, and this was achieved by 2020. And then this commitment was extended to workers in the supply chain with the aim of achieving this by 2030. The focus is very much on places on manufacturing and agriculture, and in geographical area where the living wage gap is the biggest, and when there's a weakest social safety net. Now there are in fact, levers that Unilever is using with its suppliers to help them, to encourage them to implement living wages. So there's two different initiatives, the living wage supplier promise and the responsible partner policy, which are meant to drive suppliers cooperation. And Unilever very much advocates for systemic change in purchasing practices, emphasizing collective bargaining. So there's a strong element of collaboration with unions and with workers' representatives and with NGOs, stressing the role of collective bargaining in wage determination, and stressing the fact that the living wage should not be a maximum but a baseline. Another very big initiative that's mentioned in the note is the Act on Living Wages, which we discussed also in last week's webinar on human rights due diligence. So Act was an initiative started in 2018 by 19 major brands in garment, textile and footwear industries, which is led by Industrial Global Union. We have Atle with us today, and it is committed to improving wages and working conditions through national collective bargaining. It also prioritizes responsible purchasing practices, and it has operation in several key countries and includes grievance mechanisms, due diligence, as we discussed last week, and collaboration among stakeholders, all relevant stakeholders. H&M has also launched an initiative called the Fair Living Wage Strategy in 2013, which was very specifically focused on industrial relations and fair wages based on skills and seniority. So it builds on 4 pillars, which are the workplace dialogue, the integration of living wages in their wage management system, a roadmap for purchasing practices, and also tries to foster government engagement to strengthen, to put in place the contextual elements that are necessary to foster social dialogue. And again, workers' representation, trade union engagement are part of the 6 key areas that H&M underscores in its strategy, and in particular, H&M has tracks supplier social sustainability. It has also commissioned external evaluations of the impact of social dialogue and involvement of social partners in the various suppliers on wages, and the impact is always measured as positive. So suppliers in dialogue programs experience higher real wages. Another interesting initiative reported in the note is the UN Global Compact. Again, I mentioned it briefly before. It is an initiative by companies that wanted to take the lead and promote living wages as an integral part of decent work. The Global Compact set up for this purpose a Think Lab on living wages, which is an initiative that encourages companies to collect data, review purchasing practices, and engage in social dialogue to ensure living wages. There's country roundtable discussions also planned stand within this. And at the moment, 248 companies have committed to 2 targets. So one is to achieve living wages for all employees by 2030. And then establishing also action plans for living wages throughout the supply chains. And last but not least, the living wage accounting tool, which was developed in 2003 by Shift, which is a nonprofit organization with leading expertise on the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights due diligence, and Capital Coalition, which is also a global nonprofit. This tool simplifies reporting on progress towards achieving living wages, fosters the disclosure of the progress made, and it highlights also the benefits of paying living wages, and it's informed very much by discussions with trade unions, stressing always the consultation with workers' representatives and the important role of collective bargaining as a primary means for closing the living wage gap. The presentation ends here, so I'll stop sharing my screen and introduce the speakers that we have with us today for our panel discussion. In the panel discussion, we really want to take stock of where we stand in terms of implementation of living wages, whether we see a positive trend in the commitments and in the implementation. We want to stress the role of social dialogue, of course, on the implementation side, and the different channels through which it can play out. We want to draw a picture of the challenges that are remaining, what we can do to address them, and also hear about some concrete success stories. There will be time for Q&A, for questions to our panel. So please do post your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring it. And at the end, we'll have time for the questions. So let me now introduce our speakers. We have Patrick Belzer, who's senior economist at the International Labour Organization. We have Sopiana Brom, who is Deputy Secretary General at the General Secretariat of the National Council for Minimum Wages in Cambodia. Welcome, Sopiana. Wilbert Flinterman, who is Senior Advisor of Workers' Rights and Trade Union Relations at Fair Trade International. And then Atle Hoy, who is General Secretary of Industrial and who was one of the co-chairs of the focus group on living wages. And we have Sophia Valne, who was the other co-chair of the focus group and is head of people strategy and labor relations at Scania. So welcome to all of you. And I'd like to start by drawing a picture of where we stand in terms of both the discussions and the implementation of living wages around the world. So I'd like to start with Patrick. Maybe Patrick, what is your perception of how the debate in living wages is evolving? Are we seeing any positive trend from the perspective of the ILO?
So hello, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting meeting. And I think the topic of this meeting is indeed very important because we're talking about the role of social dialogue in living wage initiatives. And we certainly from the ILO, we believe that there is a need to strengthen this component in living wage initiatives. There are lots of positive elements, I think, in the last few years. You've asked me about the recent trends, and I think that all these commitments that have been made by companies and also all these initiatives show that there is a growing awareness of the unacceptability of the level of wages that we still find in the world of today. We have a world of inequality. We have a world in which about 600 million people still are working poor. It means that these are people who have jobs but are not able to live above the poverty line. and there are many more millions who live just above the poverty lines, and some of these are definitely in the informal economy, but some of these workers are also connected to global supply chains. So I think this awareness, this realization is very important, and the initiatives that we are seeing are a reflection of the realization also that we will not achieve the SDGs, and we will not have social justice and social progress if we don't address this important issue. Of course, from the perspective of the ILO, we are a tripartite organization. So we have governments from around the world who are members of the ILO. We have the workers' organizations from around the world. We have employers' organizations from around the world. And I think that the message that I can hear from these different actors and constituents of the ILO is a desire to see a stronger involvement of all national partners in the debate. The social partners, the workers, the employers at national level in producing countries want to be involved. They want to be able to sit around the table. They want this to be a shared responsibility to work towards living wages. So they want to avoid a disconnect between global initiatives and local debates around wage policies and levels of wages. And so that is true for some of the living wage benchmarks or estimates that exist, but also for the operationalization, I want to say, of these living wage initiatives, which have to take into account the broader context in which they take place. And so they cannot happen in isolation in global supply chains. They must be connected to national minimum wage setting institutions, to national discussions on the promotion of collective bargaining. And I think this is one of the challenges of getting to the next step. And in that regard, it's perhaps important to share the information also that we see progress also in the ILO. So our governing body in November has approved a meeting of experts to take place in February of next year on the issue of wage policies, including living wages. And so this is the first time that we're going to have a discussion on living wages and how they fit into the broader framework of wage policies and principles that must be taken into account when setting wages. And so this meeting of experts will take place in February. If all goes well, which is what we hope, they will produce conclusions that will be submitted to our governing body in March, and which would strengthen the ILO's mandate and provide also guidance to the ILO on how to engage more strongly in these living wage initiatives and debates. And so what I can say for sure is that social dialogue is going to be at the heart of the ILO's approach. And certainly also, as a second point, I can say, I can highlight the importance of not only measuring living wages and the needs of workers and their families, but also understanding and taking into account economic factors in making living wages a reality, because we can measure living wages and we can measure them with assessments of the cost of living, the needs of workers, their families. But when it comes to actually implementing living wages, we have to know what is the capacity to pay of enterprises. We have to look into purchasing practices and prices that are paid in supply chains. And so certainly this is also going to be emphasized as an important issue, which maybe needs to be addressed in somewhat more in depth. So I'll stop there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks a lot. Very encouraging to see all these positive developments from the ILO side and then more globally. Wilbert, at Fair Trade, you have been very engaged in the living wage discussions, particularly in the agro-food supply chain. What is your perception of the progress that is being made? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the invitation. From our perspective, we've come a long way from the days that there were arguments about the relevance of the living wage concept, the question whether living wage could be measured, and so on and so forth. I think at this time, living wage has become mainstreamed as a key indicator for human rights and decent livelihoods. In ESG, in the Global Reporting Initiative framework, accountancy standards even at a European level, but also HRD legislation. So living wage has become more than only a topic of advocacy for international human rights. It has become basically an issue of compliance. Obviously, this puts a lot of wind in the sails of the advocates for living wages, and that's a good thing. That also has led to more active support and declarations of commitment from major actors in certain sectors of agricultural related to agricultural supply chains. For instance, IDH, the Institute for Sustainable Trade, has managed to convene governments and retailers from 4 different European countries around a joint roadmap for living wages in the banana industry, which is an immense feat and holds a lot of promise. Obviously, as Patrick pointed out, this cannot be disconnected from conversations about shared responsibility. Ultimately, the groups in the markets that make these pledges need to work to enable the supply chain to make it happen, and that is also that also means that the suppliers and producers have to have the resources to pay the workers more than is currently the case. I must say that these efforts have led to a lot of activity. I won't say that has led to great strides in wage improvement. I think if we refer to implementation of living wages, I would say that has to do with actual wage improvement, not only with activities and prep work and all the discussions around that. You need to be able to measure that the wages are going up as a result of those activities. It is positive, though, that those activities have become more concrete and focused on this enabling process to give suppliers the capacity to pay and to cover the cost of sustainable production. Fair trade tries to do its part. We've recently developed a new tool called living wage reference prices. Not really a plug and play model, so to say, but really want to provide practical solutions, and with us also other groups that are in the same space, so that it is possible for business to play its part. And obviously, this is not a core job of business. This is something that is essentially added to the mix of their activities. That's why it's important to have those services provided to them. What is finally very positive, I believe, is the involvement of the ILO. Last year, Patrick's group came out with a policy brief on setting adequate wages. I think that was greatly welcomed and truly appreciated. it is really important, I believe, that the activities around promotion of living wages, particularly in the agricultural sectors where I'm active, ultimately go back to supporting wage-setting institutions, international labor standards, and that the ILO helps to bring those efforts together around these principles. And in that regard, yeah, I hope for more collaboration also with the ILO. That can be an important opportunity for convening those actors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilbert. Very interesting points you're making. So if we move on to highlight the role of social dialogue here, Atle, how do you think social dialogue can support the implementation of living wages? What is the experience with of industrial?
Thank you, Glenda, for inviting me. Referring to the two last speakers, a lot has happened on the theoretic part of this. The question is, has it happened in practice? And Wilbert alluded to that not being the fact. And I'm going to try to tell you why. Because there is not enough social dialogue. The only way you can have a sustainable development of towards living wages is through a social dialogue where you have responsible workers' organizations and responsible employers' organizations. If you implement a living wage without that, it can be crushed the next year. And also another thing that we need to take into consideration to have a social dialogue, as I said, you need a strong trade union, you need strong employers organizations. The fact is that we are getting closer to 6% organized people, workers in the world, down from 7% over the last 10 years. So we're moving definitely in the wrong direction. There are more countries today than last year and the years before that are in serious violations of the right to organize and the right to collective bargaining. That is, in my opinion, the reason why it's not working. So yes, there is a lot done on the theoretical level, but in practice, if we don't get down to the real respect for the right to organize and the right to collective bargaining, we will not get there. So that's a very short start from my side.
Thank you, Atle. Very good points of how social dialogue is crucial when you get to the implementation, and what are the challenges that you refer to, like workers' representation. So Piana, in Cambodia, you've come a long way, right, towards achieving better pay conditions. And what role did social dialogue play in that process?
Thank you, Glenda, and good evening from Cambodia, and to all participants and panelists. It's my pleasure to be here and to be invited by the organizer. Actually, in Cambodia, the social dialogue is the key that the government tried to promote so far. Probably you know the labor law that we are implementing currently is from 1997, and we set several mechanisms in the law in order to promote the role of the social dialogue. Currently, in practice, beyond what we are talking about, the minimum wage, I want to press a bit about the way that we use the social dialogue to promote the working condition, to promote the industrial relation in Cambodia. So we have quite a lot of a tripartite mechanism in Cambodia. First of all is the Labor Advisory Committee. The Labor Advisory Committee is the tripartite body that is responsible for monitoring and discussion on the issue related to the labor issue or industrial relation in the labor sector in Cambodia. And also we have the one effective and well-known labor dispute resolution mechanism. It is the arbitration council. It also the tripartite body, which social dialogues play I mean, here's a very important role that all party, both trade union and employers, certify with the mechanism. We also have the social dialogue, very intensive social dialogue to promote the well-being of worker within the board of the National Social Security Fund, which is the tripartite body mechanism as well. And now our colleagues from the ILO may know well that the National Social Security Fund in Cambodia is developing quite a lot, and it have the worker well-being, improving a lot. Back to the role of social dialogue in the wage setting in Cambodia. Now we have the National Council for Minimum Wage, which is the tripartite body that we have like 17 members from each government, trade union, and employer. From this, I just want to recall that from 1997, we don't have this kind of mechanism, and the minimum wage setting is not regularly taught in Cambodia. So, for instance, like the first minimum wage set in 1997, it happened due to the talk between government and employer, two party, and then they set the minimum wage, and then the second one was in 2000. It was 3 year or 4 year apart. 2000. We have the tripartite body at that time, but the kind of social dialogue, the sense of social dialogue was not there, because we don't have the clear rule, clear principle of what we call the mature social dialogue at that time. I think the remarkable point is from 2015 with the important role of the technical support from the ILO, that they support the government and also coordinate with the employer and employee side to have the kind of a tripartite workshop. I can say it the starting point that we agree on the principle of minimum wage setting, the criteria, the schedule for adjustment. So those kind of things we discuss a lot up to 2018, that we formulate, that we take those kind of discussion in the minimum wage law that promulgated in 2018. I think for my personal view, the mechanism that we are using now is quite stable, and it is the result from the mature social dialogue in Cambodia, not only in wage setting to improve the worker, the income of worker, but also the industrial relation and also other working condition in Cambodia. So I stop here.
Thank you, Sopiana. It's very interesting to see how social dialogue now plays a much bigger role, and how you've come from a situation where they were not involved and what the social dialogue has allowed to Cambodia to achieve. Now let's move to concrete examples, and I move to you, Sophia, who with Atle you were co-chairing the focus group. So do you want to share the experience of Scania in implementing living wages along the supply chain, both let's say the success, but also the challenges that you encounter?
Of course, thank you very much, Glenda. It's a pleasure to be here and meet you all. Yeah, so Scania has roughly 57,000 employees and thousands of suppliers located in more than 100 countries across the globe. So, of course, this makes the task complex and important. So to secure this in the value chain, we have structured our work in group policies where we have given minimum standards for all the employees. And we have also implemented a supplier code of conduct to secure the same applies in our suppliers. As supporting tools, we are implementing a job architecture where we are mapping all the positions in Scania. And once we have this in place fully, we will sort of globalize our annual salary mapping process that we conduct together with our employee representatives, securing equal pay and of course also giving us a very good possibility to benchmark and secure the level of wages across our organization. And just as been mentioned here earlier, we also see the social dialogue as a fundament. So to continuously improve that, we launched a program in our top management meeting this spring, a program that we co-created with our employee representatives and called the Labor Relations Improvement Program. So we are now rolling that out in all our entities to ensure that we have prerequisites for early involvement and a partnership to create the Scania conditions for the future, because of course this is a compliance topic, but it's also very much connected to successful business going forward. So all in all, we have a lot of activities going into securing good conditions for our people and for Scania, but it's of course not always easy.
Thank you, Sophia. And moving now to Wilbert and then to Patrick. So Wilbert, do you have anything to add? Do you see, I think you hinted to it in your first intervention, you know, what are the challenges, particularly in the supply chain, in the producing countries, to implementing living wages?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that fundamentally a key difficulty is that the business model of foreign investment in various agricultural sectors has been based on low cost of production. So so basically businesses that have sprung up as a result of foreign investment can be viable as long as current cost structures are maintained relative to the revenue of business. If we now come and tell those companies that they have to work towards living wages, then essentially that spoils their business model, that turns it upside down. So that's difficult by design. Actually, some sectors don't lend themselves very well for living wage interventions, unfortunately. Nevertheless, we must continue to hold business and foreign investments also accountable for the choices that they make. The other one is relative productivity in the same agricultural sector, where in some origins of the same product, productivity is high and allows employers to actually afford a living wage for workers. And in other origins, in other countries, productivity is much lower due to other all kinds of circumstances such as climate, all kinds of barriers basically to higher levels of efficiency. And if we impose the same target on all those various origins to reach, let's say, living wages by 2025 or 2026, we risk leaving the lesser productive origins and their workers behind. And this would be really a negative consequence of positive efforts to reach living wages, where we don't bring entire sectors along, but only the most efficient origins are being rewarded for the right metrics, so to say. So that's an issue. The other thing is that we still see in agricultural sectors symbolic compliance with freedom of association, where there's invisible barriers to union organizing of workplaces, and these invisible barriers are not picked up by auditors and buyers and retailers and general public. That may lead to an assumption that things are right, that basically there's no problem, that low unionization and CBA coverage is to be accepted, while in reality anti-union sentiments may be widespread and keep workers from even considering forming a union, which is obviously a critical step towards collective bargaining. And as Atle already explained, it's the most sustainable way of reaching living wages. So, and finally, we see that all actors in the supply chain need to support these efforts, particularly the elite firms in agricultural supply chains. Those are the retailers. And so if retailers don't support efforts of traders and producers and NGOs like Fair Trade to work towards living wages, or they do that only for specific product categories that are important to their business and important to their consumers, then that is a critical piece of the puzzle that is missing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilbert. I want to give the floor now to Patrick, particularly focusing on the challenges. I think Wilbert concluded on it a little bit, the challenges of engaging stakeholders in the producing countries in particular.
Yes, thank you very much, Glenda. And indeed, when I was thinking of the difficulties or challenges of engaging stakeholders, first thing that came to my mind was still the restrictions in terms of freedom of association and collective bargaining that are reality in many countries. And it's been mentioned by Wilbert and Atle. And partly as a result, you have sometimes very weak institutions, social partners, weak trade unions, weak employers organizations. So that can be a real challenge in terms of bringing these partners on board, but also in terms of them playing a meaningful role in the discussion on living wages. Secondly, I want to say also I think there is a knowledge deficit or information sharing deficit from living wage initiatives that have not really sought to engage producing countries, trade unions, governments, and employers organizations from the South very much in these discussions. So we sometimes receive calls from governments, particularly from minimum wage fixing institutions like the one that Sofiana is working in. And, we had a call from a country in Asia. They wanted to know what this issue of living wage is. They were saying, we're working with you on the minimum wage. We have an institution here which sets the wage floor. It's the Minimum Wage Commission. It's a tripartite institution. We're having discussions with the ILO on how we can make the social dialogue more evidence-based. And now there is this issue of living wages. What is it? And if we want to get a global conversation on this issue, we need to bring these partners on board. Otherwise, these institutions like Sofiana's institution are going to look at living wage initiative as something foreign, and will not really be able to connect to it. So I think that is very important too. And then third point I want to quickly mention is I think we hear from trade unions also the concern or the question of how these living wage initiatives and all the estimates of living wage benchmarks can serve as an input and contribute to strengthening collective bargaining rather than circumventing it. Because, let's face it, there is also a possibility to use a number instead of having a discussion or a collective bargaining process with workers. And so I think we need to reassure also these partners that collective bargaining, social dialogue is part of the model.
Thank you, Patrick. Very important points you're making here. And I want to remind the public that they can post questions in the chat, because we'll soon get to the end of the panel discussion, so we can engage in a bit of an exchange with you. Now we've heard about the challenges, but we also have instruments at our disposal. And so I'm coming back to you, Sophia, to ask you how high of a priority living wages are for Scania, but also how did you make it happen? What was important to make it happen? Was it a company culture? Was it a drive from the high, or perhaps from the bottom? So what were the key ingredients for Scania?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but I think a starting point could be the Scania purpose, where we want to be the leaders in developing a sustainable transport system. And we've translated sustainability into carbon dioxide, of course, circularity, and people. And that reflects very much what I mentioned before, the value-driven corporate culture where respect is one of the core values. So I think it's very much a partnership between Scania management and our employee representatives, I would have to say, and an involvement of the corporate culture and evolving the business, because these two, of course, needs to go hand in hand. I think there is a lot of effort now being made, not lots of new legislation coming in. It was mentioned the reporting and the human rights due diligence, and all of this, of course, supports us in creating a good system and the prerequisites we need. But I think it basically boils down to that we feel that it all starts and ends with people, and this is important.
Thank you very much, Sophia. It's good to hear about the genuine commitment, and also remind ourselves that there's also also a regulatory commitment already existing or coming up very soon. Atle, the floor is yours now to tell us about what instruments do unions and employers have. Can we leverage global framework agreements, for example, for this purpose?
Well, obviously, I mean, as I started my first intervention, you need to secure the right to organize and right to collective bargaining. And through our global framework agreements, which we have with a number of big multinational companies, the companies with their signature guarantee basic trade union rights or all the fundamental rights in their own companies and in their supply chains. So in that way, we have a legal framework of dealing with this. And then, of course, we will have issues to deal with in the different countries. But again, if you have organized labor in the workplaces around the world, we don't have to get that actively involved. We need to get involved to make sure that people are allowed to organize and can form their unions, so they can be this cooperative partner, but also competitive partner with the business in the daily life of the industry. So yes, global framework agreements, definitely. We have the Accord. We just concluded our negotiations with the 200 of the biggest brands in the world, extending the Bangladesh Accord to new countries around the world to make sure that health and safety is taken care of. But part of this is also for us to build trade unions, because you can't have health and safety mature without proper trade unions that make sure that this happens on the ground. I'm sure Sophia can say a lot about that, on how they work in Scania on health and safety. But again, it's one of these issues. Then just briefly to get back to Patrick, I'm going to be more direct because I'm guessing that you're talking about Bangladesh. And we had the minimum wage board coming out last week with the new minimum wage, or not the board, the minister, because in the end it's the minister who decides, with a minimum wage of 12,500 taka a month, which is far below a living wage. And this is the wage then set by the Bangladeshi government, which has now resulted in a lot of demonstrations. 4 people are dead, 50 people are in prison, and it's a crackdown on trade unionism, because it's a fear that that's got powerful trade unions will drive wages up over 12,500 taka, which is still below the living wage. So, I mean, there's a lot to be done, and we're working with all of the brands in the Accord to make sure that we have systems of getting both brands and also workers to understand the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining. We do so through the Act, which has been mentioned here previously. And of course, it's extremely important that the responsibility is also taken by the brands, because they have to make sure that the factory owners can pay a living wage. We can't demand a living wage from factory owners in Bangladesh or in Cambodia or anywhere else if those who are buying the products are not willing to pay that living wage. And in the end, if nobody's willing to pay a living wage, then maybe there shouldn't be production.
Thank you, Atle. Thank you for those reflections. And now I'm turning to Sopiana. So in Cambodia, as you told us, the tripartite body that you lead on is setting minimum wages, right? And but you did tell me when we were preparing this talk that the concept of living wages you're using is close to a concept of the concept of minimum wages you're using is close to a concept of living wages. So how is that? Can you tell us a bit more? What you are using as criteria to set a minimum wage?
Well, thank you. Calculating the living wage in Cambodia, I'm not really sure how to calculate it, as Patrick just mentioned, but the criteria that we are using for the minimum wage setting is considered for social and economic factor. It's fully in line with the ILO convention. That in the worker side, we have three sub criteria. First, the family situation that we looking into the average member of the wage earner in family and the dependent member of the family to make sure that the minimum wage that they earn can support the member at the minimum level. I mean, we look at the inflation rate and we look at the cost of a living. That the mechanism ensure that the minimum wage need to be higher than the poverty line of two people, not only just the poverty line of individual worker, but also their dependent member in the family. So I think it is the worker side, but like Patrick just mentioned, we also think about the ability of the company to pay. So that is why we set another criteria, for instance, the labor productivity, the capacity to pay, the competitiveness of the sector. Just to let all know that in Cambodia, we have the minimum wage only for garment and textile sector only, while the other sector, the wage is freely set by the market. And we also have the one more criteria on the labor market situation. We need to look at the impact of the employment, particularly in the sector. So that is why I said the concept is like we set the minimum wage based on the need of worker and family, and also the sustainability of the industry or the sector in specific in Cambodia, garment and textile sector in Cambodia. So yeah, I think the mechanism that we have done so far, at least for the minimum wage, is quite well and acceptable by all parties. They are all happy, even though after the negotiation of minimum wage talk, they show their I mean, they want more for worker, and the employer they want less actually, but the minimum wage by the end of the day is set. But I think it is the beauty of the social dialogue, right? It's no problem. After that, all are happy, and next year they will come again to discuss the new rate of minimum wage. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sopiana. And I see Patrick wanted to react on this. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yes, thank you. I wanted just to clarify also from the ILO's perspective the difference in the concept of a living wage and the concept of a minimum wage. So a living wage is the idea that the wage is high enough to ensure that the workers and the families have decent standard of living. So it's a social definition of a wage level, if you want. The minimum wage is the legal floor that is either statutory or agreed through collective bargaining, that sets the floor below which no employer will be allowed to pay any wage earner. So we have a convention on minimum wages, which calls for the consideration of two factors in determining a minimum wage level, which is one, the needs of workers and their families, and we could say this is the living wage. And on the other hand, the economic factors, the capacity to pay of sustainable enterprises, because let's not do any wishful thinking. You know, when you set the minimum wage, often the capacity to pay of local SMEs is very low and represents a constraint on the level of the minimum wage. So we often have minimum wages that are below living wages. And we have to look at other mechanisms too to make living wages a reality, including collective bargaining can set wages that are above the statutory floor. And so we have to look at different initiatives, voluntary initiatives that can be taken to set wages at the level of a living wage, even where the minimum wage is constrained by the low capacity to pay of some other actors, you know, that are maybe not in global supply chains. Now, of course, an aspiration would be that minimum wages would be at the level of a living wage. And then instead of having to do calculations, 100,000 different calculations, we'd use the minimum wage as an indicator of the living wage. And it would be much easier in terms of complying with this living wage.
Thank you, Patrick, for the clarifications. Very useful, especially because there are two questions in the chat, and they're both about clarifying the difference between different wage floors. Let's call them like living wage vis-a-vis the minimum wage. And now a concluding question for everybody. So we've discussed examples. So we've heard from Scania, that's an excellent example of good practice. Of course, we've also heard from Sopiana, and we know that also we have heard at the sectoral level, right, initiatives that affect specific sectors. But what can we do? What would be your one or two suggestions to make this initiative scalable? So to apply to more companies. So what would your suggestion be, Sophia, for example, to other companies? What would be necessary, Sopiana, for example, to extend the coverage to other sectors? So what can we do to scale up and to have living wages replicate these positive experiences on a bigger scale? And I give the floor to Sophia first.
Yeah, I think it's a question actually of having a regulation, a government input on sort of creating the prerequisites for social dialogue, is my feeling. And from there, it's of course a question of building trust. And I think in Scania, we've seen many examples where we can, together with our employee representatives, create prerequisites that we need to be successful in business. So for me, it's the combination between regulation and the partnership, going forward.
Thanks a lot, Sophia. Atle?
Well, I could almost say amen to that, but just let me elaborate a little bit, because I mean the short-term solution is just to enforce legislation everywhere, but that is not sustainable long-term solution. So in my opinion, the only end solution is that we increase respect for the right to organize and collective bargaining. That is the only long-term solution. Then you create the conditions you need in the workplace to create a profitable company with living wages and decent conditions.
Thank you, Atle. And now Sopiana.
Yes, thank you. For country level, and specific for Cambodia, based on experience, I think we still think that the social partner is the key to promote the the wages of workers. Another thing related to the labor related matters, but the key success for that, I think it is how they play the role, how effective is the role in the dialogue. So meaning that they have to have enough knowledge on the topic that they are member of the kind of the social dialogue platform. It is the key important thing that in Cambodia we would like to see all the social partners play their effective role in that platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofian. And then Wilbert.
Yeah, thank you. I believe that, that any company that makes pledges on living wages in their supply chains needs to have a workable model for sustainable purchasing practices, whereby the costs of sustainable production of suppliers are the basis for price setting. And so this issue of price is often overlooked, although it's been encouraging that the ILO has also mentioned it actually as a critical aspect in achieving a decent work. Excuse me. The other thing is that in discussion, particularly in the private sector and involving NGOs and civil society, it's really important that social dialogue is placed at the heart of those programs. Obviously, besides relevant to wage increase, collective bargaining is critical to have discussions about the impacts of productivity increases that could be considered in order to work on living wages, or to avoid the so-called waterbed effect, whereby the costs of paying for higher wages is paid for by reducing other terms and conditions of employment. All of that can be addressed in collective bargain. It needs to be understood. And just before actually we started this webinar, I read a quote of the Director General of the ILO. He said that one institution that continues to play a role in delivering outcomes that are fair, equitable, and inclusive is collective bargaining. And there's a need to step up efforts to promote this, and this is really important. And so years ago, when I started this work with fair trade on living wages, there were actually two groups. There was one group that was saying, we need to put all our money on social dialogue. There was another group that said, we need to put all our money on technical tools, living wage benchmarking, and so on and so forth. And Atle will probably concur with that sort of tribal situation it was almost. And I think in the future, what we could consider is that the technical tools that are developed to support wage improvement are actually used to support and are placed at the service of collective bargaining. So that good bargaining practices are being promoted by developing adequate technical tools and capacity building for trade unions and employers. Thank you.
And last but not least, of course, Patrick.
Thank you. I thought Wilbert made a superb final statement, but sorry to spoil it with my additional remarks. But I agree with with what's been said in terms of concluding remarks. I would say, if I had to pick one piece of advice, I would say enlarging the discussion to bring the different tribes together, but to involve also the producing countries much more with their wage setting institutions and also their governments, to have a real global discussion on equal footing between North and South and producing and importing.
Thank you, Patrick. And just before we conclude, there is an additional question in the chat, which I read out from Bev Hall, asking, how do we ensure that the living wage narrative is embedded in fundamental rights, negotiated collective bargaining, she says in parentheses. I think, Patrick, you've told us how the ILO is moving somehow in that direction, because the discussion is now starting, right? And
yes, I think it's a good question. We see more the fundamental rights as a prerequisite for a fruitful conversation on living wages. But here the question is more how to embed the living wage narratives in fundamental rights or in collective bargaining. I think that is still a bit of an open question. And it's also for the workers and the labor movement to decide, how they use this concept of the living wage, the opportunities presented by these initiatives to embed the concept in their own work on promoting collective bargaining and negotiating wages.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we're coming to the end precisely on time. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Romina, for opening the webinar, and thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for to the audience. Let me just remind you that there is one more webinar for this year in this series of webinars, which is coming up on on social dialogue and the just transition, which will take place on the 12th of December. So if you want to register for that, remember to do so. And the webinar links are all on the Global Deal page, and we'll be disseminating about the webinar shortly. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been an extremely interesting discussion. Thank you for participating. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.